Ladies and gentlemen, dear presenters, dear participants, thank you so much for joining in the United Nations Conference on Space Law and Policy, the Outer Space Treaty for the 21st Century. We'll just give another couple of minutes while we wait for some more presenters to come in. I understand that there are some technical difficulties, and honestly, we've been having some of those on my end for some time these last few days. And I really want to thank you for your patience and understanding in this modern age. While we look for Nick.
Ahead of Niklas's, I tried sharing my screen. Do you see it?
Yes, we can see it just fine.
Perfect. I have some camera issues, so there's technical issues on my side as well. It seems to be going around. I do apologize for that. The most important, however, is that you can all see my screen. You don't necessarily need to see me as long as you can all hear me.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your screen, and I just see that we have Nicholas in. So let's go. We proceed, and then we'll go to Nicholas right after your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Should I start? Great. Thank you so much. So to everyone present, thank you really for being here, and a good morning from Vienna. It might be afternoon or might be repetition to all, and that's why I'll leave it with saying one sentence about it, but it can't be mentioned enough. The Outer Space Treaty was truly a groundbreaking agreement and achievement. Established in 1967, at the height of what is often referred to as the space race in the middle of a Cold War, and still today has such important relevance and truly laid the foundational legal framework for international space law. Now, when it comes to Article 9, it plays a vital role within the whole context of the Outer Space Treaty. And Professor Marchisio, I believe, already jumped into and delved into the aspects that are referenced in sentences 1 and 2, specifically in regards to due regard. But the article continues, and in fact, it's quite a long article with 4 sentences altogether, and it underscores the necessity for all spacefaring nations to conduct their explorations and use of outer space with due regard to the corresponding interests of others, ensuring that the activities are pursued with the understanding that space is not infinite and that space activities can, to some degree, be quite dangerous, can cause harm, and therefore it is so important that cooperation is at the center of space activities, and that there is a mechanism to consult one another. So it's a crucial tool, Article 9, for ensuring that space remains a realm truly for peaceful and cooperative exploration. But Article 9 is also a living document. Why is it a living document? Because as our capabilities and ambitions in space evolve, so does also the interpretation of Article 9 and the usage of Article 9. So the historical context, or genesis, however one wants to call it, really goes back to the 50s and 60s, as do so many of the principles, in fact, all of them, in regards to the Outer Space Treaty. So we had the launch of Sputnik in 1957 by the Soviet Union, followed by a series of other activities by specifically 2 states. You had the United States and, at that time, the Soviet Union. But alongside competition, because there was competition, but there was also a clear realization that to be able to conduct space activity, we have to do so collaboratively. We have to do so peacefully. And this realization came out of was driven by the understanding that space should not become an arena for conflict and or nationalistic claims. So, especially in the beginning years of drafting the Article 9 specifically, there was disagreement about harmful interference or harmful contamination, the obligations under due regard, but these were resolved. And how were they resolved? Just as they are resolved nowadays, through diplomatic negotiation. And in fact, an early example of how the consultation mechanism was used is in fact already in the 50s, so before the Outer Space Treaty was established. So the early consultations between states, specifically the US and the Soviet Union pertaining to their lunar missions, can be seen as such an example. So this was more of an introduction in regards to the historical context of the article, but now I would really like to delve into the specifics, specifically sentence 3 and sentence 4. And I think to do so best, it would be good if we read these two sentences, because there are specific words therein that are not there by mistake. They were highly negotiated and consensus was found, and there's a reason why the sentences are the way they are. So if we start with sentence 3, it states, and I quote, "If a state party to the treaty has reason to believe that an activity or experiment planned by it or its nationals in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, would cause potentially harmful interference with activities of other states parties in the peaceful exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, it shall undertake appropriate international consultations before proceeding with any such activity or experiment." That's sentence 3. Now, sentence 4 sounds similar, but is not. It states that a state party to the treaty which has reason to believe that an activity or experiment planned by another state party in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, would cause potentially harmful interference with activities in the peaceful exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, may request consultation concerning the activity or experiment. So what these two sentences distinctly mandate is a proactive international consultations to preempt harmful interference to even happen. So before harmful interference even takes place, to preempt that this could even be a possibility, the Outer Space Treaty promotes this inherently important tool, namely the tool of consultation, this important diplomatic tool of negotiation. So let's look at what this can mean in practice. So the sentences oblige states, or specifically the third sentence, obliges states to consult preemptively before engaging in activities that may cause harmful interference with the space endeavors of others, which is embracing a central principle to space law, namely conflict prevention through diplomacy and mutual respect. So specifically, a state planning an activity or experiment in space must, before proceeding, undertake appropriate international consultation if it believes that such activities could potentially interfere with activities of others. And this is not merely a recommendation, but a binding obligation, as the term shall indicates. And in contrast, however, the fourth sentence confers a right, not an obligation. It's a right. It's a right allowing a state that may be affected by another's planned activities to request consultation. So while may suggests a choice or a right, it's essential to view these sentences together, because where there is a right, an obligation on another party is implied. They shall, you may. Sentence 3, sentence 4. So the provisions frame this mechanism for negotiation and conflict resolution, which is inherently part of the realm of space law. And we will get back onto the specifics of the consultation mechanism, but briefly also look into the concept of harmful interference. Now, harmful interference presents a challenge, of course, especially considering the rising number of space activities. I'm sure that nearly every speaker before me has mentioned the rising number of space activities. And whilst there's no clear definition of what harmful interference means, of course, we can look into other treaties, other similar principles, jurisprudence of the ICJ, but generally, it could be seen as any action that adversely affects the operations or safety of space assets. So this could be tangible threats like space debris, or intangible threats like disturbances impacting satellite functionality, for example. And again, there's no definition. This is just a possible way of seeing the term. Now, looking at something that did in fact happen, everyone, I'm sure, who is working or dealing with space activities has heard of the collision between the Iridium 33 and the Cosmos 2251 satellites, which was a wake-up call in a sense. Space debris was created, and this space debris that was created could, of course, be seen as causing harmful interference if this could be foreseen. Now, that is another aspect to consider, especially when it comes to this Article 3. But now let's look at the article, or the Article 9 in connection with other space treaties, specifically the linkage to the Liability Convention, because we have other space treaties beyond the Outer Space Treaty that build on the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. So while the Liability Convention also does not use the term harmful interference, it does operate on a similar premise, in the sense that it stipulates that if a space object causes damage on the surface of the Earth or to aircraft in flight, or if it causes damage to another space object in outer space, here requiring, however, an additional element of fault, the launching state is liable for compensation. So this is reflecting a similar concern for the activities of one state, not adversely affecting another. So both of these treaties, and it of course makes sense because the Liability Convention builds, as I mentioned, on the Outer Space Treaty. Both of these treaties share this foundational notion that states should not undertake activities that harmfully interfere with the interests and property of other states, and they should, however, engage in dialogue, in cooperation. Just briefly, to also find similar notions in other treaties, in other documents, in jurisprudence. And I'm trying to keep the presentation a bit shorter. When I practiced yesterday, I was way over time. So, Mike, I'm keeping an eye on time. But is, in fact, for example, UNOOSA, so the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. And many of you know very well that there are stark similarities between UNCLOS and the Outer Space Treaty, but among its extensive provisions in UNCLOS, it does also include guidelines to prevent harmful interference with maritime navigation and activities. For instance, it stipulates rules regarding the prevention of pollution, which could be seen as a possible form of harmful interference, and ensures freedom of navigation while also mandating that states exercise their rights and freedoms with due regard for the interests of others. So here also an approach that mirrors what Article 9 states. And last but not least, I'd also like to mention the Gatchikovo-Nochmorosh case, which is significant in regards to the concept of transboundary harm, but also highlights the need for international cooperation and consultation in projects that could have cross-border environmental impact. Now back, however, to consultation. We'll start with sentence 3, and then briefly, because it's quite similar to sentence 4. So sentence 3, just as a brief refresher, requires that if a state has planned for an activity or experiment in space that it believes could potentially interfere with the space activity of other states, it must conduct international consultations before proceeding. So it's important to note that this obligation, in fact, also exists if the activity is planned by any nationals of that state. And the obligation for states to consult with others before proceeding with any activity or experiment could be triggered by a variety of scenarios. Again, it is not stated in the Outer Space Treaty as such, but if we just look at what a space activity generally could be, it could be the launching or deployment of satellites, changes to the orbit of existing objects that could bring them into proximity with other space objects. And consultation process is especially important when it comes to exploration missions. However, of course, no type of space mission makes it more important than the other. But I would just like to give you a small example. For example, now a nation plans to send a rover to Mars, and it must consider whether this mission could potentially interfere with the scientific equipment or operations of rovers from other countries already present on the planet. And in this case, there is no veto right of the states that are already on Mars. They cannot say, no, we do not allow you to participate in that activity. Quite to the contrary, the Outer Space Treaty gives states the freedom to explore outer space in Article 1. But to really try to foster and promote the peaceful use, the conflict-free use of outer space, there is this consultation mechanism. And the Outer Space Treaty is foundational in stating that states should use this consultation mechanism and try to find a solution to anything that could be potentially harmful. One brief example, again, I will not repeat what UNCLOS says in this regard. They have a similar preventive dialogue mechanism in the treaty. But another case that maybe should be briefly mentioned in this regard is the pulp mills case by the ICJ, as the pulp mills case really also dealt on the one hand, again, with transboundary harm, but clearly also in regards to emphasizing the benefits of consultation and emphasizing how essential consultations are. It namely did not only suggest that consultations should take part, it made it a mandatory exercise when states' activities bear the potential for significant transboundary potential environmental harm. And the court also said that these consultations should be genuine. So genuine in the sense that a mutual understanding and agreement should be the outcome of such consultation. So they should not just be a perfunctory step to fulfill some type of treaty obligation. So it's important to note that the Article 9, so specifically now in regards to the sentences 3 and 4, do not only provide a mere formality, which the state of origin has to go through with no real intention, just as the ICJ stated in the pulp mills case, but that there should be an intention of reaching agreement. And I repeat myself here, but I think it's important to note also, however, that the article does not, as I mentioned, provide this veto right to the state that might be affected. So it's important to understand that the consultation in order to prevent harmful interference is a procedure or duty that deals with the phase prior to the situation where harm or damage might actually occur. And this is different to the fourth sentence. And I'll keep it short here because we then also have a brief slide on the differences between sentences 3 and 4. So 4, on the other hand, gives a right. It stipulates the right of states to consult on space activities that may potentially cause harmful interference. And the exercise of this right is not just theoretical. It has, in fact, been put into practice, whether it's now specifically sentence 4 or 3. But I would like to share with you an example, again, going back to the 50s and 60s, midst Cold War. It was these sentences, and I mentioned it at the beginning, were put in practice because the Soviet Union and the US, in fact, did enter into dialogue about the missions to the moon, specifically setting a precedent here, really, for corporations. And another example, maybe not specifically derived from sentences 3 and 4, but definitely pertaining to the term of cooperation, which is also mentioned in Article 9, is in fact COPUS, the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. The committee and its 2 subcommittees meet 3 times a year, and states meet and states discuss and states proceed with their diplomatic negotiations to try to make sure that space is used peacefully and space is used sustainably and safely. So this specific article tries to prevent any harmful interference to occur in the first place. However, and here I would like to go to the difference of the 2 sentences, the timing of the request for consultation, as read from sentence 3 and 4, displays a difference, because in sentence 3, the state initiating the activity bears a proactive duty to consult other states before authorizing or beginning any potential interfering activities if it has cause to believe that it might be harmfully interfering. That's also important to note, however. So this is anticipatory. So on the other hand, sentence 4 allows for ongoing engagement, granting a state that may become affected by the right to request consultations not only prior, so the request can be made prior, of course, if the state has information on it, but also during the conduct of activity. So this dual structure ensures both a preventative and corrective measures can be put in place for addressing potentially harmful interference activity. So the distinction between these 2 sentences underscores the treaty's comprehensive approach, while sentence 3 is really about taking responsibility from the outset, ensuring that due diligence is exercised before the space operations that risk interference are underway. Sentence 4 acknowledges that some impacts of space activities may only become apparent or problematic during their operation, necessitating in addition a mechanism that permits affected states to voice concerns at any point. Possible challenges, and this is my second to last slide, in case I am running very late on time, and I will hurry up here. The possible challenges, of course, exist, but all of the challenges can be put aside through cooperative mechanisms, through consultation, and truly through the mechanisms also available to states at the UN. But one of the challenges maybe to look into is first about the identification of stakeholders, or let's say affected states. Determining really which states might be affected by space activity could be complicated. You're planning an activity and you might not know exactly who could be affected by it. Also, technical assessment is required, and some aspects of the technical assessment might not be available to you. Information sharing is also based on the effectiveness of the openness of states to in fact share this information. And last but not least, diplomatic resources. Engaging in consultations does require diplomatic effort by states. But even though there might be challenges, they are minor compared to the benefits that can be reaped if taking part in these consultations. The consultations, again, are truly a mechanism to foster and to enable the most important aspect of the Outer Space Treaty, namely that peaceful use of the outer space. So before I end my presentation, maybe just a brief outlook of space activities and how sentences 3 and 4 can be applied to that. So the recent developments when it comes to space exploration, especially the increasing number of private space actors, plans to return to the moon and Mars, they really highlight the importance of a robust consultation mechanism. New technologies and the increasing potential for a broader range of space activities, from large constellations to deep space exploration, really underscore the necessity for clear, effective, and adaptable consultation processes as envisioned under Article 9. Even though written in the 60s, in the 50s, in fact, already, they are still as useful as they were then, maybe even more so. So the relevance truly in the 21st century, I think, is clear. The relevance of the Outer Space Treaty itself, but also Articles 3 and 4 are clear, especially to maintaining the peaceful nature of outer space and to foster an environment where the benefits of space can be realized globally. So I hope that this presentation met the expectations you had, Michael. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rosanna, for going through this very complex part of Article 9. Clearly, this is an area that, well, it has not been used, at least not publicly, and this is a way, of course, of states to contact each other and to work out between them various aspects of space activities, like you rightly point out, to prevent harmful interference with the activities of another. But this mandatory, or at least this right to be consulted that is in the sentence 3, is quite related, of course, to the information available, publicly available, that states may evaluate their own programs and then proactively go to states where they know that other programs are going on, and then consult with them because they have evaluated their own and have determined that there could be a potential for harmful interference with the activities of that other state. And that is, of course, presupposing that information is made available regarding the activities of states. And that kind of also presupposes that the right to be consulted is based upon the willingness of a state to provide information about what it's doing. So this is a two-way street of providing information and then self-evaluation of those activities of others, and in the planning stage. And then, of course, the sentence 4 as well, this permissive may consult if the activities deemed to be interfering with the activities of others. Again, very complex, not used, but potentially could be the basis of numerous opportunities to expand international cooperation and consultation among states, and using mechanisms clearly that we have in the Outer Space Treaty. And this aspect of sharing information will be dive more deeply into here just a little bit by our next presenters. And this is, of course, just underscores how these articles are so interrelated. Now, without further ado, I would like to go ahead and move to our next presentation, from our esteemed good colleague and our good friend, Mr. Nicholas Hedman, who will share some words about planetary protection, also an item under Article 9. Thank you again, Nicholas. I'll just go ahead and hand it to you. I'll go ahead and share your slide. Thank you so much.
Hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Nicholas.
Excellent.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Michael, if you screen my presentation and turn the slides, that would be awesome. Excellent. Next slide, please. So, first of all, I would like to thank Rosanna for helping me out. I had problems with my computer this morning, but now we are set to go. So we have heard already Rosanna talking about potentially harmful interference and the complexities surrounding that notion. And yesterday we heard Professor Marchisio elaborating on the principle of due regard to the corresponding interests of other states parties to the treaties. And I think it was actually a good timing that we dealt with due regard first and then harmful interference. Because when we look at the history, particularly the process of negotiating the Outer Space Treaty starting in early 60s, it is interesting to note that the 1963 resolution on the Declaration of Legal Principles in its operative paragraph 6 includes due regard and harmful interference, but not harmful contamination. That came straight into the Outer Space Treaty, and as we know it today, Article 9. My presentation today is specifically about planetary protection, but before entering into that area, I would like to also make a comment regarding harmful contamination. You will see on the slide that I have underlined certain terminology in Article 9, and the reason for that is just to make a note about the complexity of Article 9. It's the longest article of the Outer Space Treaty, and nothing in Article 9 is defined. So there is, throughout those decades since the adoption of the Outer Space Treaty, there has been a constant debate regarding the meaning and preciseness about those terms, as we have heard also earlier from the presentations I mentioned. Harmful contamination is heavily debated in academia and among scholars, as it could be an indication of an environmental provision in the Outer Space Treaty. As we know, the Outer Space Treaty does not contain any environmental provisions. And this is in contrast to the Moon Agreement. Article 7 of the Moon Agreement goes further, and in paragraph 1 of Article 7, it starts by declaring that in exploring and using the Moon, states parties shall take measures to prevent the disruption of the existing balance of its environment. And obviously, referring to the Moon also indicates that other celestial bodies are also relevant in that regard. So the Moon Agreement is clearly, in a way, an environmental protective agreement. The Outer Space Treaty does not have such provisions. So harmful contamination, what does it mean? There is quite an active debate about this, whether harmful contamination could be seen as a way of harmful contamination in terms of avoiding pollution. There has been mentioned in literature, space debris could fall into that criteria. There is also a debate regarding the interlinkages between Article 9 and Article 3, of the Outer Space Treaty, which broadens this perspective of international law to be taken into account in space activities, and to the extent international environmental law could also be seen here in the context of harmful contamination. Nevertheless, I'm not going to dwell on that any further. I'm now going to orient you about one area that is quite developed, and where there is state practice and where states are actively pursuing international cooperation, and that is in the area of planetary protection. So, starting off with the blue shaded paragraph here on the screen, which is the one concerning harmful contamination, in planetary protection, harmful contamination is what we refer to as forward contamination, and the avoidance of adverse changes in the environment of the Earth is labeled as backward contamination. And you will see that in the coming slides. Next slide, please. So again, in the early years leading up to the Outer Space Treaty, it was quite interesting to note the role of COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research, as we know, a non-governmental organization founded in 1958 and the first observer organization to the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. In the 1964 report of Cooperación, the committee included verbatim the entire resolution, as you can see, the council resolution of COSPAR from the same year. And that is quite a significant proof of the recognition by states members of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space on the impact and value of the work that were being undertaken by this organization, COSPAR. So what COSPAR was predominantly concerned with at that time was the potential harmful effects of space experiments. And please recall what Rosanna said earlier in her presentation just before mine about the history of Article 9 in terms of harmful interference. Harmful interference, the interference of space experiments and activities was really on the radar of states in the early years leading up to the Outer Space Treaty. So COSPAR had made studies on the pollution of upper atmosphere, particularly from the launching of space objects. Also something that is labeled as orbiting dipoles. And that is actually something very specific relating to a project by the United States at that time, the so-called Westford project, where the United States put copper needles in orbit to enhance telecommunication. And that was a concern to the Soviet Union at that time and sparked debate also within the scientific community, in particular here through COSPAR. COSPAR then also started looking at, in around 1962-63, on contamination of the moon and planets, particularly concerning what we know today is planetary protection. And in this context, a panel on standards for space probe sterilization was set up, and all of this information is contained in those pages of the Cooperación report from 1964, and it's available on the website of the Office for Outer Space Affairs. So COSPAR had an impact on the negotiations of the Outer Space Treaty, because after the 1963 Declaration of Legal Principles resolution, states started negotiating also the inclusion of harmful contamination into what we know today is Article 9. Next slide, please. So again, as I said, the basis for planetary protection, and particularly the policy on planetary protection, which is maintained by the Panel on Planetary Protection of COSPAR, is the Article 9 provisions on harmful contamination and adverse changes in the environment of the Earth. So Article 9 is fundamental for the way that states are internationally cooperating and nationally carrying out missions to the moon and other celestial bodies. What is also interesting to note is the relevance of Article 6 on international responsibility for national activities in outer space. It's very important to note that the policy on planetary protection of COSPAR is a standard. It serves as a guidance, and it is not a legally binding instrument, and it's up to the respective states to take that into account and to implement their rights and obligations under the treaty. And that is why in recent years, in the Panel on Planetary Protection, we are emphasizing the relevance of Article 6 in that regard. Next slide, please. So, as I already alluded to, there is a panel on planetary protection within the COSPAR system, and this panel is meeting frequently. It is developing and updating the policy on planetary protection, which I will come to in a minute. What is important to note here is that, and that is shaded in blue on the screen, is those two principles of forward and backward contamination. And in terms of forward contamination, meaning what organics and what biological material could contaminate sites for further investigation on celestial bodies. So what the planetary protection community is concerned with is the future of scientific investigations in situ. As I already said earlier, this is not an environmental protective mechanism. So it's not concerned with environmental protection of the moon and other celestial bodies. It is rather the future of scientific investigation of the chemical evolution and origin of life. So it is really concerning biological contamination. I already explained the nature of the policy itself. And by the way, the document is available on the webpage of the Panel on Planetary Protection on the COSPAR website. And I am giving you the URL in a coming slide. So the policy again is a scientifically based document, and it serves as a standard and a guidance to states to implement their rights and obligations under the Outer Space Treaty. And that is quite important to note. Next slide, please. So the present panel on planetary protection has a structure whereby there are representatives of national space agencies, and there are also independent expertise in relevant fields for planetary protection. And you can see it here marked in yellow, the areas that are represented through this panel. And as I already alluded to earlier, we are concerned with biological and organic contamination. So that is really the core here. So what we are talking about is biological contamination. We are not talking about radioactive contamination, and we are not talking about chemical contamination, although when it comes to organics, there is also a quite close relationship between biology and chemistry there, and there are chemical substances also in the organics, but it's really biological contamination that is the core perspective of this panel. And you can see there the representatives of the space agencies, and this is quite interesting to note that in this panel, which belongs to a non-governmental organization, there are governmental entities being involved in the work and in the cooperation and coordination surrounding the evolution of planetary protection, because this is an area where there is constant new knowledge coming to humanity. The more we know about planets, the more we know about moons of planets and asteroids, the more knowledge we gain, and we can develop further the policy that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. So the policy on planetary protection that I mentioned before is really centered along several categories. And I know this slide is quite cramped. There is a lot of information there, but I wanted to illustrate the various categories involved in the policy that are guiding states, but also other actors in their missions to the moon and other celestial bodies. And obviously, the bodies of the solar system where we today know, or rather we perceive that there could have been life earlier, or there could be life presently, particularly in moons, the so-called icy moons or icy worlds of the giant planets of Jupiter and Saturn, where we know that there are ice crusts, and beneath those ice crusts there could be large water deposits, liquid water, and even oceans. And there is a lot of studies going on since long, but more evidence is needed on the composition of the water underneath these ice crusts to see whether life could replicate in this water. And obviously those bodies are the most sensitive in terms of planetary protection, and therefore gain the highest protective standard. And that is what is told by the categories. And obviously in the policy as a whole, the categories then, of course, trigger mechanisms and certain protective measures on missions, but also when it comes to return back to planet Earth, particularly for samples, where it is very important to not take the risk of bringing back any type of organic life forms from the solar system, which could contaminate the biosphere of planet Earth. Next slide, please. Just to mention in the coming few slides, I only have a few slides left. A couple of years ago, namely 2021, the panel decided to make certain relaxation of the previous conditions and requirements for the moon. The moon has for long been only a documentation requirement, so it's only in terms of documentation and no further measures, protective measures that have to be taken. But in this documentation requirement, there is also an organic inventory included. And we decided after several rounds of discussions and studies that it was about time to make a few relaxation for future missions to the moon, whereby the main part of the moon, the majority of the surface of the moon, does not have that requirement of organic inventory apart from the South and the North Pole. So the two polar areas do have the full requirements of documentation, including organic inventory. And this is the latest substantive scientific change to the policy, and it was made in 2021. Next slide, please. Just to mention how the panel works, we receive sometimes requests from space agencies for certain evaluation, and that happened particularly here on the right-hand side with a Martian Moon Explorer MMX mission by JAXA, where JAXA wanted a peer review, and you can see that in the text of this slide. And they also wanted the panel to express itself on the mission to the two moons of planet Mars. And what was important in that context was whether earthbound return would be restricted or unrestricted. And with the scientific evidence at hand on the two moons, Deimos and Phobos, we concluded that an unrestricted Earth return for any samples would be sufficient. There is also a lot of studies being undertaken by members of the panel, and indeed it's quite a big issue in the astrobiology community of the scientific community, so to say, on planetary protection of the outer solar system. I already related to the so-called icy moons and Europa of Jupiter and Enceladus of Saturn, which are the two most precious moons for further studies. We are now currently in the panel discussing changes in terminology, where we will start operating with icy worlds. Earlier, we talked about icy moons, we talk about ocean worlds, but now we are moving ahead with the term icy worlds, because the majority of those objects, or all objects, are actually having an ice crust at the surface, and there underneath there might be liquid water. So this is an ongoing scientific debate within this community. I just wanted to illustrate that for your benefit. Next slide, please. One example that is coming in a few years is the Mars Sample Return Mission, a joint mission between NASA and ESA, where there is the plan to bring samples back from planet Mars to Earth. A very complex procedure. You know already that the rover Perseverance is already on Mars and is conducting studies and is actually sending back information for the sample return to actually bring the right sample. And what we are all, of course, talking about here in planetary protection is to be given evidence of past life, or whether there could actually be still some remnants of life forms on planet Mars. Probably past life, but that is, of course, an evidence that will be given, hopefully, with the conclusion of this mission, which I suppose, if I'm correctly understood, the particular Mars sample return mission will begin around 2027, 2028, and then we will see how it goes. It is an exciting mission because it's the first time where there will be a sample brought back to Earth from the red planet. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide, and I just wanted to again repeat a few perspectives here on planetary protection and governance. Already, the Outer Space Treaty I've already mentioned. In 2017, the Cooperación report had a paragraph on the importance of planetary protection, which you can see in the second arrow there, where Cooperación noted the long-standing role of COSPAR in maintaining the planetary protection policy as a reference standard for spacefaring nations and in guiding compliance with Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty. As I mentioned earlier, this is really the fundamental provision for planetary protection and the implementation, and I would say coping with the policy on planetary protection itself. It's also interesting to note in the 2019 Cooperación guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, the so-called LTS guidelines, there is a chapter on scientific and technical research and cooperation. And in that chapter, there is the guideline D1, which actually stipulates that states and international intergovernmental organizations should consider appropriate safety measures to protect the Earth, that is backward contamination, and the space environment from harmful contamination, take advantage of existing measures, practices, and guidelines that may apply to those activities and develop new measures as appropriate. And this, of course, relates to planetary protection, but it's interesting to note the terminology and language used where it says, and the space environment from harmful contamination, which really broadens the perspective beyond planetary protection, which is only concerned with the moon and other celestial bodies. So here, the LTS guideline in question is actually broadening the perspective and moving into what I earlier mentioned, the discussion and debate regarding the space environment and environmental protection of void space, of celestial bodies, but also of orbits in outer space. So that is my presentation, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Nicholas, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to see you and to hear you and to see this wonderful work that you're involved with now after so many years as secretary of the committee. It really is a pleasure. And just, I would like to just mention, as we're sort of a bit low on time, just this importance of this environmental protection aspect of this treaty provision and the work of states in cooperating under this and to essentially implement this treaty provision. And it's really quite extensive. And we see the seriousness that states place upon this issue in their cooperative activities and their information sharing under this. And in fact, this is an excellent example of how states have used long-standing mechanisms for sharing information and for cooperating and collaborating on space missions and to ensure that they meet the obligations under the treaty, but also with the overall arch of protecting humanity and serving humanity's interests in outer space activities. Nicholas, I really want to thank you so much again.
Thank you.
We will of course be presenting, we will be uploading all the presentations on the website as well as the recordings. And I will also endeavor to go through all of the chat comments and make a chat document to post as well, answering a lot of these really excellent questions that have been raised so far. I note that there is even one on the nuclear power sources that are used in planetary missions and exploration missions. And that is entirely another subject, but very, very interesting as well. But all is connected, truly. to these planetary missions. And of course, now we, as we're talking about international mechanisms of cooperation, I really would like to now turn to our foremost expert in this area, who has been with us and a former chair of the legal subcommittee, as well as chair of the working group on international mechanisms of cooperation, to talk with us a bit about a treaty provision that may get overlooked, but nevertheless is a real core area of establishing a verification methodology under the treaty for verifying that space assets and space activities are for peaceful purposes. Well, without further ado, I see our beloved Professor Aoki. Please, you have the floor. Do you want me to share the slides from my side? Thank you
Yes,
so
please.
much.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, please, Michael. Well, could you share the slides, please? And thank you very much for your kind introduction. And well, I'd like to express at first my sincere gratitude for the UNOOSA, you and your team, for preparing for this 3 days wonderful seminar. So, well, for the next 20 minutes, I'll make a presentation on rather elusive but very important Article 10. The next slide, please. Thank you. Article 10 is one of the last articles agreed in the drafting phase of the Outer Space Treaty in 1966. As many other articles in the Outer Space Treaty, Article 10 was produced in a specific background and necessity, and the state practice has been developing since then. So after briefly touching upon the drafting history and the agreed interpretation of Article 10 in 1966, I'd like to describe how international cooperation has been enriched through agreements between the states concerned. As continued success of the exploration and the use of outer space owes a great deal to the ever-increasing international cooperation, and this will remain the same in the future, it seems worth reviewing Article 10, providing the observation of the flight of space objects to ensure peaceful purposes. Yeah. So, well, could you go to the next slide, please? Oh, so sorry. Next slide, please. Thank you. Article 10 provides that in order to promote international cooperation in the exploration and the use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, in conformity with the purposes of this treaty, the states parties to the treaty shall consider on the basis of equality any request by other states parties to the treaty to be afforded an opportunity to observe the flight of space objects launched by those states. The nature of such an opportunity for observation and the conditions under which it could be afforded shall be determined by agreement between the states concerned. The part underlined may remind us of some other articles in the Outer Space Treaty. Next slide, please. Thank you. Article 10 has some resemblance to the text of Article 1, Article 3, and Article 9, which provide international cooperation. And next slide, please. Looking into the structure of the Outer Space Treaty comprising 17 articles, the main part of the Outer Space Treaty comprised two of the important UNGA resolutions made in 1963, that is Resolution 1884 and 1962. Residual 8 articles were formulated during the negotiation of the Outer Space Treaty in 1966. Among them, 4 articles are final clauses setting forth the procedures of the entry into force, amendment, withdrawal, and so on, and only 4 articles, including Article 10, contain substantive legal rights and duties. Next slide, please. This is a comparison chart, Articles 1 to 9 of the Outer Space Treaty and the 2 General Assembly resolutions. This clearly shows that Article 10 is not the reiteration of the previous UNGA resolutions. Next slide, please. Then, well, these are residual 8 articles. And next slide, please. Yes. So let us check the drafting phase of the Outer Space Treaty in the COPIOS and the first committee of the UN General Assembly. Next slide, please. Both the United States and the USSR submitted a draft treaty of the Outer Space Treaty on 16 June 1966. Neither proposal had a provision corresponding to the present Article 10. The origin of Article 10 was a discussion at the Legal Subcommittee of the COPIOS in July 1966 with respect to the second sentence of Article 1 of the Soviet proposal, which provides that the parties to the treaty undertake to accord equal conditions to states engaged in the exploration of outer space. Well, which states that conditions of international cooperation. On 29 July 1966, the USSR submitted a working paper to detach the second sentence of Article 1 and to make it an independent article. That is, state parties to the treaty will accord other states parties to the treaty conducting activities relating to the exploration and the use of outer space equal conditions for observing the flight of space objects launched by those states. Next slide, please. Based on the comments by various delegations, the USSR submitted another working paper to revise the July proposal on 13 September 1966. The first paragraph remains the same, but the second paragraph was added. The meaning of the second paragraph is that State Party A shall reimburse the expenses on the assistance to be provided by State Party B for observing the flight of space object of State A from the territory of State Party B. Next slide, please. Based on further discussions and comments, the USSR submitted a revised comprehensive draft treaty of the Outer Space Treaty on 4 October 1966. After deleting the red parts on the slide, that's setting out the question of the reimbursement of the expenses incurred by the state affording the observation opportunity, consensus was accomplished, thereby becoming Article 10 of the Outer Space Treaty. Using the next slide, I'll talk what was the biggest issue to solve and what was the final interpretation of Article 10 as of 1966. Arguably, the greatest issue of Article 10 was as to whether the text implies the most favored nation clause and the state party, which has a tracking station of State Party X in its territory, has to allow other states parties to establish such tracking facilities as well. From the reading of the text, the answer seems yes. If the most favored nation clause is applied, granting that State A allows State B to establish tracking facilities for observing the flight of State B's space object, State A must allow State C to establish the same facilities if requested. If State C doesn't allow any states to establish tracking facilities, State C doesn't have to allow State A to establish tracking facilities. So, while State C doesn't have any duty to provide the opportunity for the observation of the flight of the foreign space object, Space A is under the legal obligation to provide the observation opportunities State C. Some delegations so expressed the view that the most favored nation clause was not suitable for international cooperation because of the technical and political realities, and that they stated that such international cooperation should be conducted by an independent and specific bilateral agreement. Next slide, please. The agreed interpretation of Article 10 that enables the consensus building was as follows. A state party that is asked to establish a tracking facility in its territory by another state party has the right to consider its legitimate interest and that after considering the request by the other state party, the requested state can reject to grant the opportunity to provide the observation of state objects or to establish tracking facilities. Delegations were agreed that any conditions to grant opportunities for the for the flight of space objects, including expenses, duration, preferential treatments for its personnel to visit, etc., would be decided by states concerned. Next slide, please. These are only a few examples of the bilateral agreements to install tracking facilities or otherwise cooperative space vehicle tracking programs. Such cooperation had started as early as around 1960, and the cooperation agreements were also made between the state and international organization and between the both space agencies. Next slide, please. Increasing international space cooperation in number, in areas, and by actors can be found in various documents. In this regard, there is a very good reference document published by the UNOOSA in 1999 that is titled International Agreements and Other Available Legal Documents Relevant to Space-Related Activities. International cooperative agreements are introduced in this document based on criteria, such as those shown on the slide, and about the observation tracking, TT and C stations and things like that. As many as 59 agreements were reported, and those are the information from delegations, from member states of the United Nations. So there may be more. So international cooperation has been developing all the time. Next slide, please. Increasing the number of international intergovernmental organizations and non-intergovernmental organizations to conduct exploration and use of outer space means increased cooperation not only between states, but also between other actors. While Article 10 of the Outer Space Treaty doesn't refer to international intergovernmental organizations, let alone non-governmental entities, agreements between those various actors on the slide have been increasing all the time. Next slide, please. By the last decade of the 20th century, it had been widely recognized that space cooperation contributes to transparency in space activities and trust building among UN member states, reflecting the indispensable status of space cooperation. The basic legal principles of international space cooperation was confirmed in the form of the UN General Assembly resolution in 1996. This provides that states are free to determine all aspects of their participation in international cooperation, and that international cooperation should be conducted in the modes that are considered most effective and appropriate by the countries concerned. The balance of the respect of the sovereignty and the principle of international cooperation is reassured here, and also this slide shows paragraph 4 and 8 state various modes and areas of cooperation and the UN law as a promotion of space cooperation that is stated, specified. Next slide, please. In the second decade of the 21st century, multi-year agenda item was selected by consensus, that is, review of international mechanisms for cooperation in the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. The strategy of this agenda is to identify common elements of space cooperation mechanisms among various fields of cooperation carried out by various actors, so as to states, especially emerging states, may make pertinent mechanisms when they think it's necessary, and when they can, so that they can make the most of the common elements found in the past. Final result is found in A/AC.105/C.2/112. And the following slides are kind of summary of the final result. Next slide, please. 5-year analysis found that majority of cooperation measures is found in bilateral agreements, either government to government or space agency to space agency. Then, subject matter of cooperation is expanding from the use of facility of another state provided in Article 10 of the Outer Space Treaty to cooperation for space application, to space exploration, and even to SSA these days. Legal nature of the instruments are, legally binding sometimes, and the other times non-legally binding instruments. And the most important finding seems that when bilateral cooperation deepens in the two countries, there is a tendency that combination of the framework agreement and implementing arrangement or agreement will be produced. Next slide, please. In the first stage, State X and State Y repeats standalone project agreements each time both countries collaborate in space. Then, at a certain point, common elements of various standalone project agreements are extracted and made as a framework agreement, FA. The merit of the FA is this can be concluded with or without an immediate cooperative project, and this saves a lot of negotiation time for the future when two countries decide they would start a certain project. Then, if there is an FA, when a new cooperation starts, all states concerned have to do is to make concrete rights and obligations concerning a mission implementation. This is called implementing arrangement. Next slide, please. So, international cooperation between the close states are often conducted through the combination of the FA and IA. Often FA is legally binding treaty, and this provides basic legal principles, and implementing arrangements are often non-legally binding instruments in the form of MOU, and this provides mission description and allocation of the responsibility of each party in addition to the basic legal principles, that is FA. Next slide, please. This slide shows how implementing arrangement is made. So this is an image. And in addition to the summary of the framework agreement, if some new mission starts, then mission description and day-to-day management is decided, and that makes an implementing arrangement. Next slide, please. The common elements found in the various FA framework agreement as follows. On the slide, in the most agreements, there are references that each party will bear the cost of discharging its respective obligations, and that each party's obligation is subject to the availability of appropriated funds. So impossible things are not legal duties. Next slide, please. In majority of FAs, there are provisions such as waiver of customs, duties, and taxes, and some protection clauses of the intellectual property rights, and some framework agreements have cross waiver of liability. Next slide, please. As the previous slide shows the image, a typical implementing arrangement contains a summary of the framework agreement. Those were like the one red part on the slide, and concrete mission description, day-to-day management of a project, a responsibility of the parties, which state will register a certain space object, and so on. So the last slide, please. So conclusion, my 20 minutes is coming. So the first, as a conclusion, first, Article 10 is a result of negotiation of the UN delegations in 1966. And Article 10 provides the realistic cooperative area and the mechanism for that day. But international cooperation has tremendously developed since then. And such development led to the 1996 Space Benefit Declaration and the COP's agenda item. The findings of that agenda item could benefit for further international cooperation in outer space, which would ensure peaceful and sustainable use of outer space. Fourth, peaceful space cooperation would ensure transparency and confidence building measures among states, and which will further enhance international cooperation. So finally, fifth, Article 10 of the Outer Space Treaty continues to play an important role as an archetype of enhancing international cooperation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Professor, thank you so much for going through this incredible body of work that you've done over these years as chair of heading up that working group on international mechanisms cooperation. It's incredibly interesting. And I really want to also thank you for going through the travaux and the early days of Article 10 and in the relationship of this of cooperation, and highlighting one of these issues that I was looking at when I was going through the travaux as well, on this most favored nation aspect, this understanding of how this would actually play out in practice, and those states that would see this as a bit burdensome or not compatible with the realities of the time in a way, and then how that even evolved into the later modes of cooperation, where in the 1996 declaration that it really should be on the terms of each state and determine how they want to do it rather than forced. And in fact, there was that notion in the very beginning of the proposal for the 1963 Declaration of Legal Principles, where international cooperation would be a duty on states, would be placed as a duty. A mandatory duty. So it's a really interesting way that states have evolved this and have really made international cooperation the most effective for their purposes and what their needs are. And it's really interesting to look back through this. And I just want to thank you so much again for having gone through this with us and shown us this perspective, especially under this very unique Article 10, which really was the genesis of a lot of that early cooperation of those tracking stations, which were so important for the space activities of the time. Because we're just so close out of time, I just want to thank you again, and really thank you for being with us as well, and sharing your views and your experience in this fascinating area. Thank you, Professor. And now I would like to go ahead, yes, thank you, and move to our next presentation and getting into this area that was alluded to before in discussions under Article 9, this elusive area of information sharing and how this fits within our cooperative efforts and what we expect to see in the future. Jean-Francois, please, you have the floor. Share us with your experience. Share us all with your experience on how we got to this information sharing place and where we can go in the future. Thank you so much.
First, I will share my PowerPoint. Just if you can confirm that it looks good on your screen.
Yes, yes, we see it perfectly.
Great,
thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for this invitation to this wonderful workshop on the future of the United Nations Outer Space Treaty. Of course, it's a challenge to follow up to Rosanna, Niklas, and Professor Aoki. This is a real challenge because those were excellent presentations, going very in rich detail, and I learned myself a lot, and it's so enjoyable to see that we can still learn a lot about the Outer Space Treaty after years working with it. I'm lucky enough to be followed by Francesca Knur, who will make an excellent presentation as well on Article 11 as well. So what I would like to propose is to have a short presentation of Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty. I am particularly glad that we just talked about the history of those provisions, the provisions of the treaty. All those provisions have their own history, and it's important to keep that in mind. Sometimes, you know, we have the feeling that we know what the treaty is about, what it says, but actually, when you start to read it, you still find some details, some wording that you were not really aware of. And it's even more interesting to see the history behind that. I was also lucky enough to be involved in the COCOSL project, and I had to comment on the history of Article 11. And I remembered how interesting it was to understand how that article was born from, of course, a global negotiation, but also from the action of three specific states. If I remember correctly, those were the delegation of the United States of America, the delegation of the Soviet Union, and the delegation of United Arab Republic, which at that time, if I'm not mistaken, was Egypt. And it's very interesting to see the final result, despite the coming and going between the delegation on the exact wording. So, sorry, just need to go to the next slide. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so first, what I would like to propose as an introduction to Article 11 is to dissect it, to come with a kind of dissection of the article and to try to understand the different elements, because this article appears a little bit like a block text, and actually it features very different ideas, very different concepts. So it's not that I particularly love colors, but I used colors to try to identify the different elements of that provision. I would like to start with an introduction. The exchange of information, to me, if I can just provide a personal view on that, exchange of information is really at the core of the Outer Space Treaty. It was at the core of the embryo of the treaty, not even 63, but I am referring to the UNGA resolution 1721, section B of 61, where you had already exchange of information as a pillar of the space cooperation. And I'm really confident in the fact that exchange of information is also the key for the future of the Outer Space Treaty. This is something we need to keep to enhance space cooperation and at international level, but also to allow national regulation of space activities. And so I think that to that extent, Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty is a key provision of the treaty. The first element that you can see in blue, if I take the text which was highlighted in blue, to promote international cooperation in peaceful exploration and use of outer space, is really the purpose of Article 11. It's interesting to see, and it's not the only article in the treaty with such a characteristic, is the fact that international cooperation is used at the same time as a purpose and as a means. So you can find it also in other places in the treaty, but also in other treaties, that international cooperation is really at the core, as I just said before, of the treaty and the concern of the drafter of the treaty. What is a little bit, let's say, unclear to me, and maybe we'll have discussion about that, and I'd be very happy to hear other opinion on that. But what is a little bit unclear to me when I read this sentence is the word peaceful. Of course, we all understand what peaceful means in the context of space exploration and utilization. Although there are several interpretations, which can be made of this term. But in this specific context, if you read the sentence, the word peaceful has a special meaning to me. If I read the sentence again, promote international cooperation in the peaceful exploration and use of outer space. What happens if you remove the word peaceful? Then you have the sentence, sorry, promote international cooperation in the exploration and use of outer space. That, to me, also means something quite sensible. But they choose to insert that word peaceful. So my question is it on purpose? Is there a specific meaning with the word peaceful in that context? And then what about non-peaceful exploration and use? I raised that question because there are several interpretations possible, as I just mentioned it, of the word peaceful. It can be in compliance with international law, it can be non-aggressive, or it can be also non-military. And I think that in the current context, it's important to know a little bit what was behind that sentence. I don't have a real answer to that. I'm just raising the question, but I think that the word peaceful in that case has to be understood correctly, and it should not be interpreted in a way that reduces the scope of Article 11. So open question from my side on the use of this term. The second element is the one highlighted in red. It's about information. It's actually that's what Article 11 is about: exchange of information. What information are we talking about? First, we are talking about information from one, let's say, one party to another. From whom do we expect information? That is said clearly by the provision. From state parties to the treaty, conducting activities in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. So we expect information from states conducting space activities. And to whom? Well, that's the most interesting part. To the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as the public and the international scientific community. The notion of scientific community here in the treaty is a form of recognition, which I find very interesting and very important under international law. It is often said that the Outer Space Treaty, one of the, let's say, the weakness of the treaty is not to address non-governmental operators or non-governmental parties. We know it's something which is now at stake and discussed. But at that time, I found it interesting to see that, at least from a passive way, we have a mention of non-governmental actors in the Outer Space Treaty. So we are talking about the international scientific community. Now, of course, the big deal is how do we define the international scientific community? But still, even if we do not have any identified channel or mechanism for sharing information at this stage in Article 11, we still have this role, and I will come back on that a little bit later, this role of the Secretary General, which has not only to convey information to states and to governmental actors, but also to the scientific community, whatever it means. But still, it's a very important recognition. Second slide on the information. It's a little bit, it's a different element which is highlighted in purple here. About what? Information about what? What kind of information do we need to share under Article 11? And this is also very interesting to see that there are two sub-elements in this element. The first one is information about the nature, the conduct, or the location and the location of the activities. That means that we have here information on what I would call the operational aspects. The connection is obvious with Article 9 that we just talked about, because there it is typically the kind of information you need to avoid harmful interferences and to allow a smooth and cooperative behavior between states involved in space activities. So this is the first part of information which are addressed by Article 11. The second part, and there you have also a link to make with other provisions of the treaties. The second part are the scientific results, the results of those activities. So this is also something that you can find, of course, in Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, with this reference to the freedom of scientific research. But I cannot avoid to make a reference also to the Moon Agreement, which is also relevant in the exchange of scientific results. You know that the Moon Agreement, for instance, provide for periodic release of scientific results for from states involved in activities on celestial bodies. So there is a way, this is a way, sharing the results, the scientific results, is certainly a way to ensure benefit sharing and to also avoid redundancy in terms of activities. That means that if you can receive scientific results from other states, from the activities of other states, you can build upon it and try to orientate your own activities towards complementary scientific research. So this is, to me, a very operative, I would say, element in the purpose, in fulfilling the purpose of Article 11. Next element is highlighted in brown here. This exchange of information must be done to the greatest extent feasible and practicable. To the greatest extent feasible and practicable. So that's what I would call a little bit the scope of Article 11. This is maybe the most mysterious part of Article 11, because of course it's not defined. What is the greatest extent feasible and practicable? If it is not defined, you can assume that either you would refer to other element of international law to try to define what means this sentence, or you can also refer to the interpretation or the practice which is followed by states parties. And there, of course, I'm a little bit assuming that you can follow interpretation according to several paths, I would say. First, you can consider the national interest. What would be the limit of the extent feasible and practicable? It could be national interest consideration, for instance, strategic defense security, or it can be national law, classified information, for instance, or ownership of data. I will come back on that also. Or it can be also technical restriction, for instance, operational condition, unknown events, unpredictable event, which would somehow cause an obstacle to the exchange of information, or even the collection of information. So what could be the guiding line to interpret this this part of Article 11? I think, of course, we have to, again, to keep in mind the purpose and the meaning of Article 11, and not to have an interpretation of those words which would make Article 11 void. It is obvious that the drafters of the treaty considered the possibility for a state to deny some kind of exchange, the release of some information to some conditions, but it is not here defined which kind of condition would restrict this dissemination of information. We can also think about due diligence as a way to interpret those words. So this is certainly one of the aspects, the elements of the Article 11, which remains to me the most open and subject to interpretation. Next one is, as I said before, the specific role of the UN Secretary General in the implementation of Article 11 and the treaty in general. It is said that on receiving the information, the Secretary General of the United Nations should be prepared to disseminate it immediately and effectively. Well, that's a job. That's quite a job, because if Article 11 would be implemented on a daily basis, I could not imagine the work for UNOOSA to disseminate this kind of information. By which means, by which channels could the information be disseminated? To whom? Again, we have some elements. We have the scientific community, which is mentioned, but we can also imagine the large public. According to which criteria and according to which standards, how to make sure that the information that we communicate is based on the same standards, means the same thing, and can be interpreted in the same way. So we have to find a kind of common language, and that's, according to what I read, would be the job of UNOOSA, to make sure that this information is conveyed, is disseminated in a way that is understandable and accessible by the largest amount of actors possible. So this is certainly one of the big challenge to me, which can be found in the outer space treaties, especially when it comes to the role of the UN Secretary General in that case. So we know, of course, that, but that's up to UNOOSA colleague to confirm what I'm saying. But we know that Article 11 is not used on a daily basis, and can be fortunate in that case. But if it would be the case in the future, maybe it would be worth mentioning or reflecting, I should say, it would be worth reflecting upon a possible mechanism of dissemination and of not only dissemination, but also collection and dissemination of those information and data provided under Article 11. Excuse me for my flute. I know I'm not very clear in my speaking, but just to come back also on a specific issue which was raised, of course, in the latest work we are now implementing in the COPWOS, the relation between Article 11 on the one hand and space resource activities on the other hand. I think it's a very interesting subject because you know that Luxembourg delegation proposed a specific reflection on the use of Article 11 in relation with space resource. As I said, I had already the opportunity to explain. I think that it's a very good idea, and it should be done in close relation with Article 9 also. There I see really the need to have this relation between Article 11 and Article 9 on the prevention of harmful interference, which supposes an efficient exchange of information ahead of the activity, upstream, I would say. So that, of course, would raise issue with respect to some aspects of the activities in the exploration of outer space that we are now dealing with. You know that in '67, exploration activities were most of them, or not most of them, I would say almost all of them were governmental activities. It is not the case now. We see the expanding role of the private sector in this area of activities. So that to me raises the question, what do we do with commercial information? What do we do with privately owned information? Do they fall? Does this information fall under the scope of Article 11? And if yes, how can we implement Article 11 with respect to those to this information and the data which are privately owned, not governmentally owned, I would say. We also, of course, have to think about the restriction which are inherent to Article 11. I mentioned the reflection I was proposing on Article on the part, the sentence saying to the greatest extent feasible and practicable. That would also apply for space resource activities. Of course, we should not have any military activities on the moon. But there might be also other kind of information which would have security aspects or strategic aspects and might fall outside the scope of Article 11. So this is raised in connection with space resource discussion. It is not limited to the space resource discussion. I think that the two questions which are mentioned here on my slide could be asked for other kind of activities. That's obvious. Finally, I would like to come to some kind of comparison between Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty and other provision of international law, starting, of course, with the UN Moon Agreement. I already mentioned the Moon Agreement in my presentation, but here, of course, we have to make, it would be interesting to at least to make a parallel with Article 5 of the Moon Agreement, which also deals with exchange of information or release, dissemination of information, information on activities, information on scientific results, not only scientific results. It's interesting to see that it's the word results which is used, not scientific results. Possible interference, any phenomena threatening human life, and that, of course, was raised in the context of the discussion we had on asteroids. And also, I think it was also made very widely public in the press, the indication of organic life, which is one of the typical information which is addressed by Article 5 of the United Nations Moon Agreement. So this is, of course, a kind of echo to Article 11 of the Outer Space Treaty. A parallel should be also drawn with respect to the 59 Antarctic Treaty, where Article 3 is providing that exchange of information on national programs should be done among the parties. That's the active, that's the active way, the active exchange of information, and there is a more passive way to have information exchange, which is in the same article, the principle of freedom of exchange of scientific observation and results. This is not phrased as an obligation for states to exchange, an active obligation to exchange, but it's an obligation to allow the freedom of exchange, which I think also an interesting way to address the issue, especially with respect to my former remark on commercial or privately owned information. Article 7.5 of the Antarctic Treaty also speak about advance notice and national expedition station military personnel or equipment which should be subject to exchange of information. And finally, the last parallel I wanted to make was with the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, where you can find several provisions. You can find them here on the slide, which also deals with the dissemination of information on scientific program and results, and the sharing of knowledge, education, and training with developing countries. So you see that this idea of exchange of information is certainly one of the, let's say, a thread that you can find in all treaties, international convention, which were adopted in the follow-up to the geophysical year 57-58, and also in general international law dealing with spaces and areas dedicated to scientific research. So I would like to conclude on this. It's not a real conclusion because, of course, Francesca will follow up and explain Article 11 in much more detail. Thank you very much.
Jean-Francois, I really want to congratulate you on sharing this mountain of information that you have and this experience that you have, and your dedication to the work of the legal subcommittee, and continuing with this and continuing to be so active, of course, in our new area of contemplating space resources and all of that entails. And it's just really a pleasure to have your contribution in this regard. Absolutely. And I will confirm with you that yes, indeed, we are trying to find a way in the office to understand what the implications would be should states start to really use Article 11. How would we disseminate that information most effectively and disseminate it most broadly to have a understanding of what the scope of the information is that could make it broadly understandable to the widest possible audiences, but also give it enough depth that it satisfies, of course, the scientific community as well, potentially. We of course have seen an incredible increase of orbital activities. The space operational space objects have doubled in the last 2 years. This has put an incredible strain on the work of the office and in the traditional way that we have handled registrations under the registration convention. This is a paper-based registration system where everything is translated into all 6 official languages and disseminated through our website that way, and also searchable through our online index. And to meet the demands of those interested in knowing this basic information about registrations, this is what we've had to do. And we hope that we can have some guidance from states on the level and scope of which they would like to implement Article 11, and we can understand what that might mean for us in this dissemination function as well. If I could just ask you one, for maybe you could share your thoughts on this, and this connection between that you raised before on the connection between the Article 11 information sharing and it triggering these aspects under Article 9. And noting also this right to be consulted necessarily by providing information up front, then under Article 9, that would put all others on notice of your activities. Potentially others would be under the obligation to review their own activities and then contact and consult with that potentially affected state. What are your thoughts on that kind of mechanism? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. This, I think it's a very important link to be made if you want really to have an effective Article 9, an effective implementation of Article 9. How can we make sure that we can assess an activity from a third party and the potential, I said at that time, it's really a potential harmful interference, or let's say potential interference, and to decide whether it is harmful or not if we don't get information sufficiently ahead. So I see, of course, you know, when I deal with authorization, I do that on a daily basis, and I see how difficult sometimes it is now for operators to come up with a clear description of their activities, even a few months before the launch. I'm astonished by that. I thought that, you know, things used to be totally clear and settled a year before. No, it's not true. Now it's more and more, maybe I'm naive, but more and more late in the process that they can really have a final view on the activities. So, of course, if we need to communicate about that, if we need to be clear about that, we we need to receive the information as early as possible. And I guess that is the same thing, of course, for other states, to make sure that those activities will not cause interference with their own activities. So to me, it's really, those are two brothers, the Article 9 and Article 11. They really need to come together to see how we can have, what we can do with this information. And that's why I wanted to make a clear distinction between operational information and scientific results. But for the operational information, we need to make clear that it is because we need to do something with that and to make sure that there is no a potential interference between activities.
Right, right. And I really thank you also for mentioning this aspect in authorization and, of course, in the continuing supervision as well. I mean, this kind of interplay between these articles is becoming more and more clear every day. The more of these activities that are being undertaken by private sector entities, this requires the state to control its risk, to comply with the treaty, and in all of these different facets. And it all rests upon gaining that information from those entities that want to engage in these activities, as well as transferring that to others out there to put others on notice of what you have going on, what you have planned going on, and then that process of self-evaluation can take place. But they're all hand in hand, and I thank you for mentioning that as well. We've seen throughout the conference a number of other aspects of Article 6 and implement. So it's there's so many areas where this is all converging, and I really want to thank you again for sharing your views, for your active participation in the working group on the legal aspects of space resource activities. It's very much appreciated, and I know that others in the group are appreciative of your contribution in that regard as well. I certainly am.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, maybe we can go ahead and take a short break and reflect on some of these aspects of Article 11 before we hear from the current chair. Jean-Francois was the former chair of a former chair of the working group on the status and applications of the 5 United Nations treaties on outer space. And we have the current chair, Ms. Francisca Canor, who Jean-Francois works closely with as well, a good friend of ours. And we will go ahead, we'll take a few minutes, we reflect on this, and we hear about what the situation is at the current multilateral context in the working group and in the legal subcommittee, the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. Thank you so much. We'll come back in 15 minutes at 12:20, if that is okay. Thank you again, Jean-Francois. I really appreciate your contribution here today. Thanks.